The water was cold. That's the first thing I remember. Not the fall, not the sound, not even the shock of it. Just the cold, pressing in from every side, and the lights of my own boat getting smaller above me. I'd been in Lake Ontario before, plenty of times. But never like this, never at night, never alone, never with someone up on that deck who wanted me to stay down. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what my late wife used to say whenever I'd start a story from the middle. Gerald, start from the beginning. So that's what I'll do. 51 years in the trucking business. I started with one second-hand Kenworth in a route between Hamilton and Toronto. By the time I sold Callahan Freight to a logistics group out of Calgary, we had 63 trucks, a cold storage facility in Mississauga, and contracts with 3 of the biggest grocery chains in Ontario. The offer came in at just under $38 million. I was 67 years old, my knees ached every morning, and my wife had been gone 4 years. I signed the papers on the Thursday in March, and took my daughter and her husband out for dinner at a steakhouse on King Street to celebrate. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter, because that's what she is, and that's all that matters. Had always been the steady one. Quiet, thoughtful, studied environmental science at Guelph. She never asked me for money. Never made me feel like the business was something she was waiting to inherit. When she married her husband 9 years ago, I walked her down the aisle at a little church outside Guelph and felt, for the first time since her mother passed, that things were going to be all right. Her husband was different. I want to be fair here. In the early years, he was fine. Pleasant, remembered my birthday, came to the lake house on long weekends, helped me clear the dock every fall. He worked in commercial lending at one of the smaller banks, not Bay Street, but respectable. He knew numbers. That was the thing about him. He always knew the numbers. When the sale went through, the numbers changed. It started small. He started calling me more often. Twice a week, then every other day. Always casual. Just checking in, Dad. How are you feeling? Have you thought about what you're going to do with yourself now that you're retired? Those kinds of questions. But underneath them was something else. Something I didn't name right away because I didn't want to believe it. He started bringing up investment opportunities. A mixed-use development in Barrie, a friend of his from the bank who was launching a private equity fund focused on Alberta energy assets. A lakefront property in Muskoka that was, he said, an absolute steal if someone moved fast. Each time I said I wasn't ready to make decisions, that I wanted to sit with things for a while, each time he nodded and said, of course, no rush, and then called again 3 days later. My daughter didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't say anything. She was busy with the environmental consulting work she'd started, and with the kids, I have 2 grandchildren, a boy of 7 and a girl of 4. I didn't want to say anything to her. I kept telling myself I was being suspicious for no reason, that he was just enthusiastic, that wanting to help your retired father-in-law invest his money wasn't a crime. Then he asked about the lake house. The property's been in my family since the 60s. My father built the original cabin on it. I've added to it over the years. Proper insulation, a new dock, a boathouse. It sits on about 2 acres on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay, and the land alone is worth something significant now. He asked if I'd ever thought about putting it into a trust structure. For tax efficiency, he said. For the grandkids, he said. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I called my old accountant, a woman I've trusted for 20 years, and told her what he'd said. She was quiet for a moment and then said, Gerald, do not put that property anywhere near his name. I asked her why. She said, just don't. I started paying closer attention after that. One evening in July, I drove up to the lake house unannounced. I'd been meaning to check on the roof. There'd been some heavy rain and I wanted to see if the eaves were holding. My son-in-law's car was in the driveway. That surprised me. My daughter had told me they were spending the weekend in Prince Edward County. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in my truck for a minute just thinking. Then I walked around the back of the house toward the boathouse. The side window of my study was open, and I could hear him on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. But I heard enough. He was talking to someone about a property transaction. He mentioned the lake house specifically. the address, the acreage. He said something about getting the signature before the end of summer. He laughed at something the other person said. Then he said, "The old man trusts me. That's the whole point." I walked back to my truck and sat there for 20 minutes before I drove home. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark in my house in Burlington and thought about my daughter and my grandchildren and what $38 million does to people who didn't earn it. I thought about my father building that cabin. I thought about my wife, who would have known exactly what to do. By morning, I had decided not to do nothing. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. Not the firm that handled the business sale. A different one. A woman who does family and estate law out of a small office in Oakville. I've known her since she articled for a colleague of mine back in the 90s. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "All right. Here's what we're going to do." We changed the structure of my estate documents entirely. The lake house went into a trust, but not the kind my son-in-law had been suggesting. The trustee was my accountant. My son-in-law's name appeared nowhere. My daughter remained a full beneficiary, but the terms were written so that the assets couldn't be accessed, transferred, or leveraged by a spouse without separate legal proceedings. Then I hired a private investigator, a retired OPP officer who now works out of Hamilton. Quiet man, very professional. I told him I needed to understand what my son-in-law was doing with his time and his connections. What he found took 3 weeks to compile. My son-in-law had been meeting regularly with a real estate broker and a notary, neither of whom my daughter knew anything about. He had opened a numbered company in Ontario the previous year. The PI found 2 instances where he had approached financial institutions using documents that referenced my property holdings, documents I had never signed. He was building the case to borrow against my assets. He needed my signature or a convincing substitute for it. The PI also found something I hadn't expected. My son-in-law had a second phone. The messages on it, which the PI obtained through entirely legal channels I won't detail here, showed conversations with the broker about timelines, about how long it would take for a healthy man in his late 60s to make other arrangements, as he put it, about what happened to estate documents when there was no will contest. I read that and sat with it for a long time. I've been planning a trip anyway. Every summer for the past decade, I've taken the boat out on Georgian Bay for a few days. Just me, sometimes a friend, sometimes alone. This year I decided to make it an occasion. I told my son-in-law I wanted to celebrate the sale properly. Just family, a long weekend on the water. He said he'd love that. Of course he did. I made one other arrangement first. The man who's captained my boat for the last 6 years. A former Coast Guard officer from Parry Sound, steady and quiet and about as honest as anyone I've ever met. I brought him in before we left. I told him what I suspected. I told him what I needed him to watch for. He didn't say much. He just nodded and said, "I'll keep my eyes open." We left the marina on a Friday afternoon. My daughter was there, the grandchildren, my son-in-law. We had dinner on the water as the sun went down over the bay. The kids fell asleep early. My daughter went to check on them. My son-in-law and I sat on the stern deck with a bottle of whiskey from a distillery near Collingwood. He poured my glass himself. I noticed he poured his own differently, less, from a different part of the bottle. It could have been nothing. But I remembered what the PI had told me, and I set my glass down and didn't pick it up again. About an hour later, I stood and said I was going to check on the captain. I walked to the bow, leaned over the rail, and then I made a decision that I want to be honest about. I went over the side deliberately. Not because I thought he was going to push me, because I wanted to see what he would do when I was gone. The water was cold. I stayed close to the hull, treading water in the dark, holding on to the anchor chain. I heard my son-in-law's voice very calm, talking to someone on his phone. He said there'd been an accident. He said he wasn't sure what happened. He said he wasn't sure what happened. He said he thought I'd slipped. He didn't call out my name. He didn't come to the railing to look. He walked to the other side of the boat and continued his phone call. The captain found me 4 minutes later. He'd seen me go in and had come down quietly from the bridge. He pulled me up and wrapped a thermal blanket around me and the two of us sat in the forward cabin without making a sound. We came back into the marina the next morning. My son-in-law had told my daughter I'd gone to bed early. He'd said nothing about what had happened on deck. My daughter embraced me when I came up from the cabin and said she'd miss me at breakfast. I told her the fresh air had done me good. He watched me from across the deck. I could see him trying to understand. His jaw was tight. I shook his hand before we unloaded the bags. I told him it had been a wonderful weekend. He said, yes, it really had. Over the following 2 weeks, I made several quiet phone calls. The Ontario Provincial Police received a file from my lawyer. The file included the PIES report, copies of the documents my son-in-law had used with financial institutions, and a written statement from the captain about what he had observed that night. Specifically, my son-in-law's behavior and his phone call in the minutes after I went into the water. I also met with my daughter alone. That was the hardest part. Not the police, not the lawyers, not the cold water. Sitting across from her in her own kitchen, while the grandchildren were at school, and telling her what I had found, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her. She asked me why I hadn't come to her sooner. I told her I hadn't wanted to be wrong. She nodded. She understood that. We are similar in that way. She understood that. We are similar in that way. She also told me things I hadn't known. Small things, looking back, that had felt wrong to her but that she'd talked herself out of. The weekend trips he'd taken without explanation. The phone he kept on silent. The way he'd become so interested so suddenly in her father's finances. She had known something was wrong. She just hadn't let herself know it completely. My son-in-law was arrested on a Tuesday. Fraud, forgery, and 1 count related to the OPP's assessment of his conduct the night on the boat. I was advised not to discuss the specifics of that charge publicly, and I'll respect that here. He was released on bail. The criminal proceedings are ongoing. I've been told by people who know these things that the outcome is not uncertain. The numbered company was dissolved. The documents he had circulated were flagged with the relevant financial institutions. My accountant reviewed everything and found no actual transfers had been completed. I had moved fast enough. The lake house is still mine. My daughter and the grandchildren came up last August. We spent 3 days there, kayaking, cooking on the outdoor grill, letting the kids stay up too late. On the last evening, we sat on the dock as the sun went down and she said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Dad." I told her there was nothing to be sorry for. I meant it. I'm not going to tell you that I figured this out because I'm clever. I didn't. I figured it out because my accountant told me to trust my gut, and my lawyer knew what documents to change, and my captain kept his eyes open. I had good people around me. That's what saved the lake house. That's what saved everything. The money was never really the point. $38 million sounds like a lot. It is a lot. But the thing that came closest to breaking me wasn't the thought of losing it. It was floating in Georgian Bay in the dark, listening to my son-in-law describe an accident that hadn't happened yet, and understanding what that meant. It meant he had looked at me, at 67 years in this world, at everything I'd built and everyone I'd loved, and seen something to be cleared away. I stayed in the water long enough to be sure. Then I held onto the anchor chain and waited for the captain. The stars were out. Georgian Bay in July, even at night, even in the water, is not the worst place to be. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said about all of this. I think she would have said what she always said when things got complicated. Gerald, start from the beginning. So I did. People ask me sometimes whether I am angry, whether I still think about that night on the bay, the cold water, the lights of my own boat getting smaller above me. And the honest answer is that I don't think about it the way they expect. What I think about, when I think about it at all, is what I chose to do next. That's the part that stays with me. I spent 51 years building something from nothing. One truck, one route, one handshake at a time. Nobody handed me the business. Nobody rescued it when the interest rates climbed in the early 90s, and I was 2 payrolls away from losing everything. I figured it out because I had to. And because I believe that if you do the work honestly and treat people fairly, the thing you're building will hold. That belief got tested in Georgian Bay at about 11 o'clock on a July night, and I want to say it held. But it only held because of what I did before I went into the water, not after. That's the part I want people to understand. I didn't outsmart my son-in-law because I'm cleverer than him. I didn't save the lake house because I got lucky. I saved it because when my accountant told me something was wrong, I listened. When my instincts told me something was wrong, I listened to those too. And then I acted before there was a crisis, not during one. The trust documents, the lawyer, the private investigator, none of that happened on the boat. It happened in the weeks before, in quiet offices, and careful conversations. By the time I went over the side of that boat, the important work was already done. What I've come to understand, and I'm 67 years old, so I'm allowed to say this plainly, is that the people who take advantage of trust almost always rely on one thing, that the person they're targeting will talk themselves out of their own instincts, that they'll feel disloyal for suspecting, that they'll decide it's kinder to look away. I almost did that. There were weeks when I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just enthusiastic, that the business had made me suspicious of everyone. But my accountant didn't say any of that. She said, trust your gut. And that made all the difference. My daughter is doing well. The kids were up at the lake house again this past summer. She doesn't blame herself the way she did in the beginning, or at least she's working through it. That takes time. Betrayal inside a family doesn't resolve cleanly, no matter how clear the facts become. But she's steady. She always has been. She got that from her mother. If there's anything worth taking from what happened to me, it's this. Paying attention is not the same as being suspicious. Protecting what you've built is not the same as being selfish. And asking hard questions of the people closest to you, even when it's uncomfortable, is sometimes the most honest thing you can do. For them and for yourself. I wish I had asked them sooner. I'm glad I asked them at all. The lake house is still there. The dock needs work this spring. I'm looking forward to it.